Most of us have been taught that hell is a generic sea of fire, a mass of faceless suffering where all who failed receive the same fate. But there is an ancient text that states something much more disturbing. Punishment is not the same for everyone. Imagine that, instead of a uniform abyss, there existed a spiritual penal code so detailed that each member of the human body suffered punishment to the millimeter, designed for the mistake you made, while the Bible you have at home focuses on glory of redemption and the sovereignty of God. A manuscript that almost entered the New Testament, the Apocalypse of Peter, decides to open a curtain that many preferred keep closed, revealing a geography of the abyss where justice is applied with a frightening symmetry. The conflict here is deep and touches the root of our faith. On the one hand, we have the canonical message of Christ's mercy and perfect sacrifice, which cleanses sin in an absolute. On the other, a historical record that circulated intensely in the hands of the first Christians, suggesting that there is a logic of proportional justice where the sinner becomes the monument of his own crime. This text doesn't just talk about fire and darkness. He describes the fate of those who perverted justice, those who betrayed trust, and of those who use their own language as a weapon. It is a vision that transforms the. Today we'll delve into the pages of this deleted text to uncover not only the graphic scenarios it presents, but the mentality of a time that believed that fear of judgment was the only brake on a collapsing humanity. Get ready, because we will reveal the symbolic logic behind these punishments and, mainly, identify the specific sin that this document deems so unforgivable that it receives the punishment severest of all the abyss, a sentence that makes every other suffering seem, light. There's a reason this book was debated for centuries before being dismissed, and what it reveals about ancient morality may change the way you view yours own walk. But before we understand the punishment, we need to look at who keeps the secrets of this vision. If this book was so read and respected by the first Christian communities, that there was in its pages that began to cause so much discomfort in the leaders of the time, to the point of him being silenced. What could be so graphic and specific in an ancient Christian text that it is considered dangerous for public reading, even though it is attributed to the leader of the apostles? The answer lies in the manuscript that history tried to forget, and that's what we'll talk about in the next block. Did you like this beginning? If you feel that divine justice is something you need be more understood than feared, write in the comments. Justice or mercy? I want to know your opinion on this balance right off the bat. To understand the power of this text, we first need to identify who the figure is, central to this narrative, Pedro. In biblical tradition, Simon Peter is not just a disciple. He is the stone on which the church would be built, the impetuous man who walked on the waters, and later, the one who denied Christ and then was restored in one of the most exciting scenes in the New Testament. However, outside the pages of known Gospels, writings circulated that intended to record profound visions granted by Jesus to this apostle after the resurrection. The Apocalypse of Peter arose in this scenario between the end of the 1st century and the beginning of the 2nd, presenting itself as a direct revelation about the state of souls and the final destiny of humanity. Unlike many texts we call apocryphal today, the Apocalypse of Peter does not. It was a marginal book or hidden in obscure sects. During the first 200 years of Christianity, he was treated with almost absolute reverence by many communities. Historical documents, such as the Muratorian Fragment, the oldest list of books considered canonical, mention that this apocalypse was read publicly in several churches, although with the caveat that some leaders still resisted his authority. It was in the border zone. For many early Christians, this text was as inspired as the letters of Paul or the Apocalypse of John. But why then did he end up being left out of the official canon? The debate that followed was intense and complex. As the church was structured, the criteria for canonicity have become more stringent. Leaders sought texts that not only had a probable apostolic origin, but which were also in harmony complete theology with the central message of Christ. Love, forgiveness, and sovereignty of the grace. The Apocalypse of Peter, with its extremely graphic descriptions of torture, eternal punishments, and its almost obsessive emphasis on physical punishment, began to be vile. I'm like one uncomfortable contrast to the hope presented by the revelation of John. Plus, there was the issue of sobriety. While John, on Patmos, saw thrones, seals, and a new Jerusalem bathed in divine glory, Peter's text immersed itself in mud and blood from the abyss. The church realized that although the fear of hell could serve as a temporary moral break, the foundation of the Christian faith should be the love of God and not just the fear of torture. Thus, little by little, the manuscript that detailed every scream and every crevice of the underworld lost space in the pulpits and ended up being relegated to the libraries of curious and studious. The silencing of this text, however, did not erase the impact it had on the popular imagination. It served as the basis for centuries of traditions about the underworld, influencing how the people saw God's judgment as a surgical operation of justice. But what exactly did Peter see that was so disturbing? What happened on these pages that made the reader feel the heat of the flames through the parchment? If this text was rejected for being too graphic, what did it say about the way does the human body respond to its mistakes? How does the text justify a soul suffering from millimetric shape for a sin committed in just one instant of life? The answer lies in the logic of proportional justice, the central theme of our next block. Do you believe that fear of severe punishment helps people be better, or does true change only come through love? Comment, change by fear, or change through love. I want to see how your personal theology deals with this dilemma. To understand the impact of Peter's apocalypse, we need to decipher the moral code that governs their views, the concept of lex talionis, or the law of an eye for an eye, applied to eternity. In the text, punishment is not just random punishment. She is an extension directly from the crime committed during his lifetime. This logic of proportional justice suggests that the member of the body that served as an instrument for sin must become the focus of suffering in court. It is a dark symmetry where the geography of hell is mapped according to the anatomy of the sinner. If the tongue was used to slander, it is there that the pain will be concentrated. If the eyes have sought after lust, they will be the target of affliction. This approach reveals a desperate attempt by ancient authors to explain justice divine as something mathematical and unquestionable. To the mind of that time, the idea of a indiscriminate punishment, a fire that burns everyone alike, seemed less fair than a punishment that reflects the gravity and nature of the error. No. In the Apocalypse of Peter, God is not only presented as a severe judge, but as an architect of a moral order where no one can claim to have received a sentence unfair, as the punishment is the exact reflection of the choice. However, this surgical justice creates a scenario of psychological horror. The text describes souls suspended by specific parts of their bodies, depending on what desire or action led them to perdition. This frightening symmetry served to reinforce the idea that the sin leaves an indelible mark on the soul, a signature that the final judgment only would make it visible and tangible. The message was clear to the second-century reader. You can separate your actions from your spiritual identity. What do you do with your body today will determine how he will be treated in eternity. The difference between this logic and human revenge is its didactic purpose. For the communities that read this text, the detailing of the sentences was not just aimed at sadism, but the protection of the community. When they learned that whoever used words to destroy the neighbor would have his tongue punished by instruments of fire, the faithful were urged to a strict control over speech and social behavior. It was an ethic based on direct consequence, an attempt to illuminate the silences of the traditional biblical narrative about what exactly happens after the final verdict. But how does this logic apply in practice? The text does not stop at theories. He dives into examples that would make anyone tremble. What happens, for example, to those who did they use the gift of speech to sow discord or lies? And what punishment in store to the sinners of the tongue reveals to us about the importance that the early church gave to truth and testimony. In Peter's code, the tongue is described as one of the most dangerous instruments of being human. Why does the text reserve one of the most graphic scenarios for slanderers and false witnesses? What was so destructive about speech that it required such punishment? Specific. The answers begin to emerge when we look at the actual punishment scenarios that Pedro described his journey, something we will explore in the next block. Question for you. Do you think it is fair that every sin has a punishment, specific, or believe that every error, no matter the size, takes us away from God in the same way? Right, sin's different, or everything is sin. Let's debate this balance. At this point in the narrative, the text leaves theological abstractions behind and leads us to a visceral tour of the abyss. Peter reports that Jesus took him to observe destiny of those who have failed not only God, but their fellow man. The logic of Ark, which we saw to be a structure of order and preservation, is here inverted. The hell of Peter's apocalypse is a place of planned chaos. The first group that the apostle sees are those who committed social sins, those who destroyed the structure of the community through greed and injustice. The focus falls heavily on loan sharks and those who have grown rich at the expense of other people's misery. The text describes these individuals in lakes of fire and mud, symbolizing the moral dirt from their transactions. The message is clear. Who used the need of the poor to multiply his own gold, he will find in judgment a wealth of pain. Unlike the Ark of Noah, where compartments served to maintain security and stability, here the compartments of the abyss are cells of proportional suffering. For readers of time who lived in a ruthless Roman economic system, this vision offered a sense of divine reparation that human laws would never provide. Next, Peter observes the fate of those who perverted justice, corrupt judges, and false witnesses. Following the rule of symmetry, they suffer punishments that attack the senses they used to deceive. If in the Bible, the ventilation of the ark was vital for life, in Peter's abyss, the air is replaced by smoke and unbearable odors, a reflection of the sweet smell that the sacrifices of Noah and Job exuded to please God. The text highlights that the abandonment of orphans and widows is not just an ethical lapse, but a direct offense to the Creator, which demands a physical and eternal reckoning. What is most striking about these social sins is the emphasis on mutual responsibility. Peter's apocalypse does not see sin as something private. Every action of injustice, financial or legal, is seen as a blow to the floating city structure of humanity. Just as each layer of bitumen was essential for impermeability of the ark, social integrity was seen as the film that protected God's people from destruction. When this protection was broken by greed, the infiltration of evil, it compromised the entire project of the soul. This part of Peter's vision functioned as a radical code of ethics for the first Christians. He taught them that faith should translate into how they treated their neighbors and others. Needy. However, as Pedro walks deeper into the center from this dark geography, he realizes that there are crimes that the human mind barely understands, can process. He begins to see punishments that are no longer about coins or courts, but of the very essence of individual morality. But what about the sins that happen in the dark, away from the eyes of the courts? There is something in Peter's vision that overcomes the pain reserved for financial oppressors. What happens when betrayal occurs within the innermost circle of human trust? The answer takes us to the next stage of judgment, where the ethics of the body become the scene of an even more intense spiritual battle. If you could choose one punishment for injustice in the world today, it would be based on financial loss, what was taken, or a punishment that make the culprit feel the victim's pain. Comment here what your opinion is. When advancing to the deeper layers of this vision, Pedro is faced with a scenario that transcends commercial relationships and enters the sphere of physical and moral integrity. Here, the apocalypse of Peter describes the fate of those who violated trust and purity in an intimate way. Following the logic that the member that sinned is the member that suffers, the text presents images of symbolic brutality that aim to shock the viewer old. It is a reflection of the morality of a time where the body was seen as the temple of soul, and any desecration of this temple required cleansing through suffering proportionate to the dishonor caused. The text details the fate of women and men who abandoned their commitments and have given themselves over to promiscuity or adultery. They are described suspended from parts of the body related to your desire, over pits of boiling mud, or surrounded by snakes of fire. For Christians living under Roman persecution, where morality public service was often lax and pressure to conform to pagan customs was immense. These visions functioned as an ethical anchor. It was the statement that, although the world could ignore infidelity and broken vows, divine judgment had eyes that penetrated the darkness of rooms and the secret of intentions. One of the darkest and most controversial points of this block involves the fate of those who committed infanticide or disrupted the lives of children. The manuscript describes a disturbing scene where the injured children themselves confront their parents in court. This image served to reinforce the doctrine of the early church about the absolute value of life, contrasting radically with the common Roman practice of exposing newborns. Here, the ethics of the body is not just about the individual, but about protecting others in its most vulnerable form. Just as Noah had to ensure that each compartment of the ark was safe so that life would not be lost, the text suggests that whoever failed to protecting life has been given an eternal weight of responsibility. This journey through the punishments of the body ends up revealing that the physical pain described is, in fact, truth, an echo of spiritual pain. The text suggests that wounds and torment are the materialization of the shame that the sinner tried to hide in life. It is the opposite of experience of Job, who, despite being covered in physical wounds and humiliation, maintained his unshakable integrity and faith. While Job proved that character can shine through ashes, the characters in Peter's abyss discover that their ashes are made of very character they destroyed. Pedro watches all this with a mix of horror and understanding. He realizes that justice of God is not blind, but rather excessively lucid. However, even among these punishments that seem to be the limit of human suffering, there is something even deeper. O Apostle notes that there is a specific group, kept in an isolation area and torment even more intense than all the others he had seen so far. Among all these terrible scenarios of betrayal and violation of the body, Pedro describes a group that suffers more than murderers and adulterers. Who are these people whose punishment is so severe that the text can barely find words to describe it? Why does knowledge of the truth make suffering even greater? The answer to this mystery lies at the apex of judgment, where the ultimate sin is. You believe that those who know the truth and make mistakes deserve a harsher punishment than those who make mistakes through ignorance? Comment: weight of knowledge, or error is error. We have reached the inflection point of this journey, the culmination of the terror and spiritual logic that the Peter's apocalypse tries to establish. After passing through valleys of agony for sins social and moral, Peter is led to the deepest and darkest place of the vision, where the punishment reaches an intensity that defies description. There, he meets the group that receives the harshest sentence in the entire abyss. They are not the murderers, nor the tyrants of the nations. They are the apostates and the blasphemers. This excluded text reveals that, in economy of the spirit, the most serious sin is not ignorance of evil, but betrayal, deliberate transfer of the light after having met it. The supreme punishment is reserved for those who, having received the word of truth and the seal of faith, they consciously chose to return back to the Creator and pursue the path of lies. The logic behind this absolute severity is that betraying the light is infinitely worse than never having seen her. The text suggests that whoever knew grace and rejected it commits a crime against the very nature of salvation, becoming sons of perdition who cannot but plead ignorance. In the revelation of Peter, these individuals are described in a torment of total darkness, but a darkness that burns, where the remorse of consciousness is as palpable as physical fire. It is in stark contrast to the security of ark, which was sealed by God to protect life. If the door of the ark was the point of salvation for Noah, the door that these apostates close to themselves in life becomes the seal of your own eternal exclusion. The text details that blasphemers, those who cursed the name of God or perverted his laws to deceive others, suffer a punishment that directly attacks your voice. If in life they use their mouths to utter darkness against the author of life, in abyss they are consumed by silence or the sounds of teeth grinding. There is a deep connection here with the story of Job, who even at the height of physical, emotional, and socially, he refused to sin with his lips or cast blame on God. While Job remained intact and faithful in the silence of God, The defendants of this vision of Peter are those who use their breath for rebellion. For the author of this manuscript, apostasy is the poison that compromises the entire structure of the spiritual vessel. Why this level of graphic detail and this emphasis on the punishment of apostasy ended up being the reason for the book's exclusion? The early church realized that this vision created a theology based almost exclusively on fear of retribution, which could obscure the core of the gospel, Christ's victory over death. While the John's Apocalypse, canonical, describes a cosmic war where the Lamb is the victor, Peter's text seems more concerned with describing the torture of the vanquished. The severity of the ultimate sin was so intense that I ran the risk of making grace seem small compared to the size of the punishment. As he contemplates the end of those who denied the faith, Peter feels the weight of responsibility apostolic. He understands that the message he carries is not just an invitation, but a matter of eternal life or death. However, as the curtain begins to fall close on these scenarios of pain, a final doubt arises. Whether Pedro's text focused both in punishment, as the official Bible solved the mystery of judgment without losing focus in hope. If the Apocalypse of Peter was silenced, where did all this imagination about the hell? How has the church managed to balance God's harsh justice with the promise of a new heaven and a new earth where there will be no more pain? The end of this story reveals to us how the biblical narrative consolidated redemption as the final word, something we will see in the next block. Do you think it is possible to be faithful to God just out of love? Or do human beings? Do you always need a fear threshold to keep from straying? As Peter's visions dissipate, we are confronted with the real reason why this manuscript was left aside from official history. The early church, at the consolidating the canon, he made a conscious choice between fear and hope. Although the Peter's Apocalypse offered a detailed answer to each sin, the narrative final biblical, culminating in the Apocalypse of John, decided that the glory of God and the restoration of creation were more urgent messages than the inventory of tortures. Where Peter's text saw mud pits and streams, John saw the New Jerusalem, a place where God will wipe away every tear and death will no longer exist. The focus shifted from punishment from the wicked to the victory of the glorified Lamb, who reigns with authority over life and death. The silencing of Peter's text was not a total erasure, but a reorientation, theological. The Bible preserved justice but anchored it in divine sovereignty. In the book of Job, for example, God does not respond to suffering with a list of punishments for friends' accusers, but with a revelation of his own immeasurable greatness. In the end, Job was restored not because he understood the logic of his suffering, but because he trusted in character of the one who gave and took away. The Bible teaches that although judgment is real and inevitable, God's ultimate goal is not destruction, but a new beginning, like the rainbow that sealed the covenant after the flood. Interestingly, the impact of the Apocalypse of Peter did not die with its exclusion from the canon. It survived in the subconscious of Christianity, influencing great works of Christianity, world literature such as Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, and shaping the iconography of the hell we know today. It served as a historical reminder that humanity always sought a logic of proportional justice. However, the strength of the Bible lies in take us beyond this desire for retribution, pointing to a sacrifice that paid debt that no human punishment could pay off. The ultimate sin of apostasy remains a serious warning, but the final word of Scripture is the invitation. He who you're thirsty, come. Understanding these excluded texts helps us appreciate the balance of the Bible we have in hands. She did not get lost in the details of the abyss, but fixed her eyes on the light of the resurrection, which changed humanity's hope forever. Peter's journey through the abyss shows us what man thinks about righteousness, but Christ's journey through the cross shows us what God did for it. The story of redemption moves forward, not by fear of a fire whip, but for the promise that the King is returning to do all things new. If you've come this far, you understand that God's justice is profound, but His mercy is what keeps the ark of our soul afloat. The secret is not in remembering the punishments, but in knowing the one who delivers us from them. Now that we've uncovered this forgotten text, you are ready to look at the Bible with new eyes. realizing that every silence and every word was planned for his salvation.